Hello there, I am Scott Telek, author of the Swithen, the Arthurian book series that leaves you with a strange, tingly sensation. And we're continuing our reading of Sir Thomas Malory's Morte today, where we are finishing off book 1 with 2 explosive chapters, so let no more time be lost. This meanwhile came a messenger from King Arthr of North Wales, and king he was of Ireland and of many isles. And this was his message, greeting well King Arthur in this manner wise, saying that King Arthr had discomfited and overcome 11 kings, and each of them did his homage, and that was this: they gave him their beards clean flayed off, as much as there was, wherefore the messenger came for King Arthur's beard. For King Arthr had purfled a mantle with king's beards, and there lacked one place of the mantle, wherefore he sent for his beard, or else he would enter into his lands and burn and slay, and never leave till he have the head and the beard. Okay, King Arthr. This is one of the most low-down, dirty, and downright dastardly characters in the Arthurian legend, and I love him for that reason. King Arthr is a warlord king who's just out there conquering kingdoms and adding them to his territory. Now, Arthur is aligned with the church and the larger leadership of England, so when he wins a territory, it comes under control of England, and it's all official. By contrast, Arthr is out there kind of a loose cannon, just trying to amass territory for himself, which will then just become part of his own holdings. But he's not just doing that. He's conquered 11 kings, which you'll note is the exact same amount of kings coming against Arthur, although they're not the same ones. And he makes each of those kings flay his face to remove his beard and give it to King Arthr. So King Arthr has made a mantle. That's the sort of cloak that goes over the king's shoulders. The one we most often picture is the red one with the white fur trim, you know, that thing. But King Arthr has made all the kings he's defeated skin their own faces of their beards and stitch their beards to his mantle, which is pretty nasty. And what are beards? They're something that only men have. So when Arthr does this, he is in effect stripping the kings he defeats of their manhood. It's an over-the-top symbolic humiliation, but this guy is one of those horrifying psycho warlords you hear about. And he's left a place open specifically for Arthur's beard. And if Arthur does not surrender his beard, Arthr will invade his territory and destroy it. So what does Arthur say? Well, said Arthur, you have said your message, the which is the most villainous and lewdest message that ever man heard sent to a king. Also, you may see, my beard is full young yet to make a purfle of it. But tell your king this, I owe him no homage, nor none of my elders, but or it be long to, he shall do me homage on both his knees, or else he shall lose his head by the faith of my body. For this is the most shamefullest message that ever I heard speak of. I have espied your king met never yet with a worshipful man, but tell him I will have his head without him doing me homage. Then the messenger departed. Now is there any here, said Arthur, that knoweth King Arthr? Then answered a knight named Neram, Sire, I know the king well. He is a passing good man of his body, as few now living, and a passing proud man, and sir, doubt you not, he will make war on you with a mighty puissance. Well, said Arthur, I shall ordain for him in short time. Arthur basically says go screw, but not before making a little joke. He says he's too young and his beard is not full enough yet to make a good fur lining. So I don't know, last time with the Romans it was just a bunch of tough talk, but now it's tough talk and a little joke. Kind of poking fun at King Arthr. That's new, and I think it shows an increase in confidence in Arthur. Now he's confident enough to poke fun at his enemies as well as just bluster. In the end, Arthur asks any of his men if they've encountered King Arthr in the past, and he meets one, Sir Neram, who is never heard from again, who basically says King Arthr is indeed a very bad badass, and going against him in war is not to be taken lightly, to which Arthur replies, alright, I'll make up my mind about it later. And now to our last chapter, number 27. Then King Arthur let send for all the children born on May Day, begotten of lords and born of ladies. For Merlin told King Arthur that he should destroy him should be born on May Day. Wherefore he sent for them all, upon pain of death. And so there were found many lords' sons, and all were sent unto the king. And so was Mordred sent by King Lot's wife. And all were put on a ship out to sea, and some were 4 weeks old, and some less. And so by fortune the ship drove unto a castle, and was all to riven, and destroyed the most part, save that Mordred was cast up, and a good man found him, and nourished him until he was 14 years old. And then he brought him to the court, as it rehearseth afterward, toward the end of the death of Arthur. So many lords and barons of this realm were displeased, for their children were so lost, and many put the blame on Merlin more than Arthur, so what for dread and for love they held their peace. But when the messenger came to King Rience, then was he wood out of measure, and purveyed him for a great host, as it rehearseth in the book of Balin le Savage, that followeth next after, how by adventure Balin got the sword. Alrighty, so Arthur sends out for all the children born on May Day, that is, May 1st, because Merlin tells him to have them destroyed. This is because of what Merlin said back when, that Arthur's child with his sister will be the destruction of him and his kingdom. Also note it says that some were 4 weeks old and some less, but if they were all born on the same day, wouldn't they all be the same age? Let's not get into it. So there's lots to talk about here. First of all, what is this monumental event doing as the last fairly short chapter after a cavalcade of important events, and with a note already moving on into the next chapter by the end? It's kind of like, so yeah, our hero's killing a bunch of babies, but let's move on, shall we? As if Malory's trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug. By the way, the whole thing about putting the babies on the ship and setting it adrift is because they thought by doing that they would be putting the decision in God's hands. Then God would decide if he wanted to save the babies or not. So I mentioned that this is a big change from the story in the post-Vulgate cycle, where it is definitely Arthur himself who has the idea to kill the babies. So Malory's trying to make it look better by changing to be Merlin's idea. You can kind of have Merlin do anything because he's a wild card and no one can control him. But it actually doesn't make much sense for it to be Merlin's idea, because Merlin knows the future and wouldn't gather the babies if he knew it wasn't going to work. So we can assume this change Malory made to get away from Arthur himself doing this heinous thing. And all of this is because the Arthurian legend isn't really about noble heroes acting noble and heroic. Remember how I said it's comparable for life itself? And part of that are the mistakes we make in our youth that come back to haunt us later. And this is the big one for Arthur, and in fact, this is the mistake that ends up killing him. This is about the thing in ourselves, that one fatal flaw that we try to deny, and it comes back to destroy us. And it's Arthur's child, it's his son, so it is literally a part of Arthur that comes back and amounts to his own destruction. Now there's something mysterious and resonant, and this is really one of the things the Arthurian legend excels at. Things that don't exactly add up one to one, yet resonate on a symbolic level. I also want to say this is my personal interpretation, and I've not seen it anywhere else, although I do read lots of Arthurian papers and I haven't seen anything denying it. Arthur is born from this circumstance with Uther and Igraine. He's born of this crime. Then he has a child that also comes from this strange circumstance, and one could say parallels his own conception, in that he suddenly obsesses over this woman, just as his father suddenly obsessed over Igraine. From both of these circumstances, a unique child is born, Arthur himself and Mordred. Now we'll flash forward to the very end of the saga, when Arthur and Mordred kill each other on the battlefield. The prophecy comes true, and that is how Arthur dies. Sorry if that's a spoiler, but spoilers don't really apply to the Arthurian legend, since the whole thing loops back on itself and flashes forward so many times. So Arthur was born of this crime, and Mordred was born of incest, and it's the end, they kill each other, and it's as if they cancel each other out. The father and son take each other out, and it's as though Arthur and Mordred's very existences have been erased. This will all be terribly interesting to discuss after we see how everything works out for Arthur and how he's treated during the quest for the Holy Grail. But this here, the ending of the first book in the saga, connects directly to the very ending of the entire saga. Now, a little detail not mentioned here is that Margaza never tells King Lot that Mordred is not his own son, and this causes Lot to hate Arthur even more. The text also says that many lords and barons were not at all happy with Arthur for doing this, but they blame Merlin more than Arthur. And the last paragraph looks forward to the next book, in which King Rience makes good on his promise to attack Arthur, King Lot makes good on his promise to continue to wage war, and we have the mysterious and engrossing tale of Balin le Sauvage. Alrighty, so you have finished reading Le Morte d'Arthur Book 1. Give yourself a hand. We did read through all the actual text, and if audiobooks count as reading, I think this does too. In a world where less than half the population reads even one book in a year, you've dived into this challenging work from 500 years ago, and the plain and irrefutable fact is, you're awesome. Now that we're done with Book 1, what can we say about it as a whole? It certainly covers a lot of ground. We go from the story of Arthur's parents all the way through him becoming king and his very first few wars. He's also made some terrible mistakes and already enacted the deed that will end up ruining his entire life. So before we even leave the first book, we've already set up the seeds of Arthur's destruction. And think about the amount of times Malory's flashed forward to the future, telling us something that happens and jumping ahead to tell us the outcome. So fate and destiny is very present in the work already, and in many cases we see the deed and already know the outcome. Now let me ask, has Arthur really done all that much that's heroic? He hasn't slain a monster on behalf of his people like Beowulf, and so far he hasn't really acted on behalf of the British people. I mention this because we all have an inkling of what we think King Arthur is from movies and TV shows we've seen, but most of that is not really what the legend is about. So the main thing I think is it's good to pull back from this concept of the hero we all want to be, this great person who does great things that we all want to emulate, and start to think of this as a work that inspires contemplation. Because think about it, when these stories were originally told verbally to people who could not read and were living an existence so rough as to be completely unimaginable to us today, they barely had any structure or law. They have no reason to be good to each other or treat each other fairly. So they hear these stories that raise questions about how they should act with each other, how they should treat women and the elderly, how men should treat women. And instead of telling those people what to think, we have these stories that raise issues and inspire them to think about those questions for themselves. Famed child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim, in The Uses of Enchantment, his landmark work on the importance of fairy tales to the development of children's psyches, discusses that it's not so important that stories for children give them a clear, spelled-out moral that is obvious. Think of so many of our entertainments today that hammer a very important message over our heads. But more important that the stories present characters that are not necessarily perfect, but are relatable in a way that helps children identify with their wish to be good. It's not the fact that virtue wins out in the end that promotes morality, says Bettelheim, but that the hero is most attractive to the child who identifies with the hero in all his struggles. This seems to be directly applicable to the Arthurian legend, in which we've seen, even in this first book, that Arthur's made a number of terrible mistakes and will make even more. It's not that everything Arthur does is wonderful and perfect, but that he's human, like we are. And like him, we wish and struggle to be good, even if we sometimes fail. The other thing Bettelheim says is that fairy tales bring up intense emotions and impulses from the unconscious and allow us to work through them in a safe way. He also says it's important that the stories be unrealistic, because if they were realistic, we try to make logical sense of them in a way that relates to the world. Whereas if they're unrealistic, we stop trying to make sense of them, and that unlocks our ability to engage with them on a purely symbolic and emotional level. to work through the thoughts and feelings in a pure way without having to try to apply it to our own lives. And I think this really applies to the Arthurian legend, because in the legend we encounter very primal, basic emotions like love, hate, violence, lust, brotherhood and sisterhood, jealousy and such like. But since it remains unrealistic, we can just work through these emotions and moral quandaries without needing to come out to a big lesson or apply them in some way to our own lives. I'll tell you one other thing that really helped me understand the figure of King Arthur. Freud, yes, Freud, in his essay Family Romances, discusses a stage many children go through prior to maturity, in which they imagine they'll discover that their parents are not actually their birth parents, but that they were truly born to far more illustrious parents. In his example, because he was writing in Europe in the 1900s, the kids imagine that their parents are actually the king and queen. They couldn't really belong to these boring, annoying people who sometimes yell and force them to clean their room, but one day it'll be revealed that they're from a class far higher and deserve a more illustrious in life, in which they don't have to do all that mundane room cleaning. Well, Arthur is that child who discovers that his parents really are the king and queen. He's the archetype of that psychological struggle. He lives the life we dream of, and he works with the thoughts and emotions that come with it. The stories that surround him exist in this psychological otherworld where forces of love, anger, longing, confusion, and rage, all these primal, very basic emotions, are worked through and find resonance, if not resolution. This is not to say that the Arthurian legend is meant only for children, far from it. But rather than a silly but fun adventure story about noble knights performing feats of arms, it's an exploration of the deepest moral and existential questions that every person alive must face. Alright, well, I hope this has been interesting and informative. When I gather enough energy, I'll continue a reading of Book 2. Almost everything we've heard up until the Questing Beast was from the early legend and was incorporated into the Vulgate. So most of what's in Book 1 is the oldest part of the legend. Now we'll be moving into a newer part from a different source, and it continues to include a lot of supernatural elements and dark magic, and it's mysterious and haunting and spooky, and I love it. It's definitely one of my favorite books in Morte d'Arthur, and we'll be talking about it next. So I hope you gleaned a lot from what you got here discussing Book 1, and I hope you join me when we get to Book 2. Thanks so much for watching.